The year was 1775, and the American colonies stood on the brink of open rebellion against the British Empire. Tensions had been building for years, fueled by taxation, without representation trade restrictions, and the increasingly aggressive presence of British troops. The colonies had begun to mobilize their militias, stockpiling weapons and organizing secret councils. In April of that year, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, and what had been a smoldering dispute burst into full-scale revolution. The American patriots, led by men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, knew that defeating the mighty British Army would require more than courage and muskets. It would require allies France the long time. Rival of Britain watched these developments with growing interest. Defeated in the 7 Years' War and forced to cede much of its North American territory to Britain, France harbored a deep desire for revenge. The American Revolution presented a tantalizing opportunity to weaken British power and restore French prestige on the world stage, but aiding a rebellion was a dangerous game. Louis XVI and his ministers hesitated, fearing retaliation or worse, failure. Still within the court of Versailles, voices began to rise in favor of intervention. One of the loudest belonged to the charismatic and visionary Marquis de Lafayette, a young nobleman whose admiration for the American cause burned brighter than most Lafayette saw in the Revolution. Not just a chance to strike a blow at Britain, but also a struggle for liberty, equality, and human dignity. Against his family's wishes, and without the official approval of the French crown, he purchased a ship, loaded it with supplies, and set sail. For America in early 1777, his arrival was a turning point. Not only did he bring much-needed resources, he also offered military expertise, passion, and diplomatic channels back to France. Washington recognized his potential and made him a major general in the Continental Army. Over time, their relationship deepened into one of mutual respect and genuine friendship. Meanwhile, in France, Benjamin Franklin worked his magic. The American envoy had arrived in Paris in 1776, wearing a fur hat that played into the French stereotype of noble savagery. But behind the appearance was a shrewd and seasoned diplomat. Franklin charmed the court, dazzled the salons, and built a strong network of sympathizers among the French elite. He spoke of liberty and Republican ideals, tapping into the same Enlightenment values that were beginning to take root in France itself. His efforts were not in vain. By the end of 1777, the tide had begun to turn in the Americans' favor, especially after their victory at Saratoga. This triumph proved to France that the colonists could indeed challenge British rule, and it convinced Louis XVI that open support might bring both strategic and symbolic rewards. In February 1778, France formally recognized the United States and signed the Treaty of Alliance. The world would never be the same. With the Treaty of Alliance signed in February 1778, France officially entered the war on the side of the American colonies. This was no small gesture. It meant committing troops, ships, weapons, and massive financial resources to a war across the Atlantic against the might of the British Empire. The decision electrified the American cause and rattled Britain to its core. Overnight, the revolution was no longer a colonial uprising, it was now a global war. France began by sending arms, gunpowder, uniforms, and supplies through covert channels, but now their involvement was open and direct. The first major military contribution came through the French Navy, commanded by Admiral Charles Hector d'Estaing. He set sail with a fleet bound for the American coastline, hoping to blockade British ports and cut off their supply lines. Though his early campaigns met with mixed results, they served a greater purpose, boosting American morale and forcing the British to stretch their forces thinner across the globe. Meanwhile, Lafayette returned to France to plead for more direct intervention. He used his personal influence and the growing pro-American sentiment in French society to secure a full expeditionary force under the command of General Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, better known as the Comte de Rochambeau. In 1780, Rochambeau arrived in Rhode Island with over 5,000 seasoned French troops. They were trained, well-equipped, and ready to fight side by side with the Continental Army. Still, coordination between the two forces was not easy. Differences in language, military traditions, and strategy led to tension at first, but through diplomacy and the strong bond between Lafayette and Washington, the alliance held firm. In the background, Benjamin Franklin continued his tireless diplomacy in Paris, securing additional loans and naval commitments. He was now a celebrity in France, a symbol of the revolutionary spirit admired by philosophers, poets, and politicians alike. His presence gave the American cause a sense of legitimacy and nobility, which played well in the French court and public imagination. Back in the colonies, the presence of French troops bolstered American efforts in key battles. Though not always victorious, their courage, discipline, and commitment to the cause inspired their American counterparts. They shared tents, dug trenches, and bled together. Their unity in hardship forged a bond that went beyond politics or strategy. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean and Europe, the conflict widened. The French Navy battled the British off the coasts of India, Africa, and the West Indies, diverting enemy resources from the American theater. The war was no longer confined to North America. It had become a true world war, fought on multiple continents and oceans, thanks in large part to France's global reach and naval power. As the year 1781 approached, both sides knew the war was reaching a climax. The British were struggling to maintain control as their forces were stretched thin and morale was crumbling. The Americans, though weary, had found new hope and strength through their French alliance. The stage was set for a decisive showdown that would determine the fate of a new nation and the balance of power in the world. In the summer of 1781, events began to converge that would culminate in the most decisive campaign of the American Revolutionary War. While the American and French alliance had seen mixed results in earlier battles, the coordination between General George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau had matured into a formidable partnership. Both men recognized that the key to final victory lay in delivering a crippling blow to the British forces in the southern colonies, where Lord Cornwallis had entrenched himself in the town of Yorktown. Virginia Washington had long desired to strike New York, where the British maintained a strong presence, but Rochambeau convinced him that the real opportunity lay in the south, especially if the French Navy could gain control of Chesapeake Bay. The plan was audacious and required perfect timing. They would march their combined armies south from New York, while the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse would sail from the Caribbean and blockade the Chesapeake, cutting off British escape routes and reinforcements. By late August, the Franco-American forces had begun their long and secretive march south, covering over 400 miles in a matter of weeks. Their journey was marked by discipline, unity, and a shared sense of destiny. When they arrived in Virginia in late September, they found that Admiral de Grasse had already arrived with a fleet of 29 warships and had defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake. This victory ensured that Cornwallis was trapped without naval support or an escape route. It was the turning point the Americans and French had hoped for. With the noose tightening around Yorktown, the combined Allied forces began a siege that would last nearly 3 weeks. They built trenches, hauled cannons, and launched a coordinated assault that relentlessly wore down British defenses. French troops played a critical role not just in numbers, but in strategy and execution. Their engineering corps helped design the siege works, while French artillery pounded enemy positions with devastating accuracy. The climax came on October 19th, when Cornwallis, realizing the futility of his situation, surrendered his entire army of over 7,000 men. It was a stunning and humiliating defeat for Britain and one that shocked the political elite in London. The victory at Yorktown would not have been possible without French support. Every element of the campaign, from naval supremacy to troop strength to military engineering, bore the mark of French commitment and sacrifice. The surrender ceremony itself was symbolic. Cornwallis refused to attend, sending his second-in-command instead, who first offered his sword to Rochambeau. The French general refused and directed the officer to Washington. The alliance had become one of mutual respect, where each side acknowledged the critical role of the other. The aftermath of Yorktown sent ripples across the Atlantic. In Britain, political leaders realized that the cost of continuing the war was too great. Public opinion turned sharply against it, and peace negotiations began soon after. In Paris, Franklin, along with John Jay and John Adams, entered into complex talks with British diplomats determined to secure favorable terms for the fledgling United States. The French continued to support the Americans even in these delicate diplomatic maneuvers. Although they had their own geopolitical interests to protect, they largely deferred to the American negotiators, trusting them to shape a peace that would secure independence and weaken Britain. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally ended the war and recognized the United States as a sovereign nation. It was a monumental achievement, one that would have been unthinkable without French assistance. From the early covert shipments of gunpowder to the climactic siege of Yorktown, France had been an indispensable partner in the American struggle for independence, but the cost for France was steep. The war added to the already crippling national debt and contributed to the financial crisis that would explode into revolution. Within a decade, yet for a moment, France had stood at the forefront of a global movement for liberty. It had defied the old world order and played midwife to the birth of a new nation. The bonds formed during the Revolution did not end with the war. Lafayette returned to America as a hero, welcomed with open arms and honored as a brother of the Republic. The American people never forgot his bravery and devotion. Streets, towns, and counties were named in his honor. Benjamin Franklin remained a beloved figure in France until his death, admired not only as a diplomat, but as a philosopher of liberty. The war had changed more than the map of the world. It had redefined international alliances, ideals of governance, and the very meaning of freedom. The story of the American Revolution is often told through the lens of patriot muskets and independence declarations, but behind the scenes it was also a story of ships in foreign harbors, secret councils in European salons, and young nobles who believed in a cause far from home. The French connection to the American Revolution was more than strategic. It was deeply human. It was built on dreams of justice, shared sacrifice, and the audacity to challenge empire together. As the ink dried. On the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the American colonies officially stepped into the world as the United States of America, independent and sovereign. It was a triumphant conclusion to a brutal war and a defining moment in global history. Yet behind the public celebrations and patriotic speeches stood the undeniable role of France, whose unwavering support had tipped the scales and made that victory possible. But what had driven France to risk so much, and what were the deeper consequences of that choice? While many American revolutionaries saw the alliance as the meeting of kindred spirits bound by Enlightenment ideals, the French court had far more complex motivations. France had not acted solely out of philosophical sympathy, but also from a calculated desire to weaken its age-old rival Britain and regain prestige lost during the 7 Years' War. The ministers of Louis XVI, especially Foreign Minister Vergennes, had carefully weighed every move, each shipment of gunpowder. Each battalion, each naval maneuver was part of a larger strategy to shift the balance of power in Europe. At the same time, however, the French public was swept up in genuine enthusiasm for the American cause. Newspapers, plays, and pamphlets celebrated the struggle of liberty against tyranny. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau were quoted alongside Jefferson and Franklin. The concept of a government created by the people for the people sparked excitement in a country still bound by monarchy and inequality. Young men like Lafayette saw in the Revolution not just a battlefield, but a vision for their own country's future. But for all its moral and strategic triumphs, France paid a staggering price for its role in the war. The financial burden of the conflict pushed an already strained treasury closer to collapse. The war had cost France more than 1.3 billion livres, adding to a national debt that was spiraling out of control. To raise money, the crown imposed new taxes that fell mostly on the poor and middle class, fueling resentment and political unrest. By the late 1780s, France teetered on the edge of its own revolution. Ironically, the same ideals that France had supported abroad began to return, home with unsettling consequences. French soldiers who had fought in America returned with radical ideas about equality and rights. Ordinary citizens questioned why their king had fought for liberty elsewhere while denying it at home. The alliance with America had been a mirror reflecting the hypocrisy of the Ancien regime. The storming of the Bastille in 1789, just 6 years after the American treaty, was no coincidence. It was the beginning of a revolution that would shake France to its core and change the world once again. But the legacy of French support for the American Revolution went beyond politics or economics. It established a new model for international relations, one where ideological alignment could outweigh dynastic ties, where republics and monarchies could become allies, and where the dreams of one people could inspire the transformation of another. It also redefined diplomacy itself. The work of Benjamin Franklin in France proved that charm, cultural fluency, and moral persuasion could be as powerful as cannons and muskets. His image in France bordered on mythical. He was not just a statesman, but a symbol of what America stood for. The rugged philosopher, inventor, and advocate of liberty, he had entered Paris a curiosity and left it a legend. The personal relationships that emerged during the Revolution further cemented the bond between the two nations. The friendship between Washington and Lafayette was more than ceremonial. It was born in the mud of battle and forged in mutual trust. They corresponded for years after the war, and when Lafayette returned to the United States in 1824, he was met with enormous crowds and heartfelt gratitude. It was a reunion that reminded both nations of their shared history. The influence of France could also be seen in the institutions and architecture of the young Republic. American leaders had studied French political theory and admired the balance of reason and passion found in the Enlightenment. They named cities after French heroes-styled buildings, after neoclassical trends, and adopted principles of secular governance and civil liberties that had been championed by their French counterparts. In turn, American independence helped ignite reform movements across Europe and Latin America, proving that colonial subjects could defy empire and win. The Revolution became not just a national event, but a global phenomenon, one that France had helped script from the wings. Even after the fall of the French monarchy and the rise of Napoleon, memory of the alliance endured. It was invoked in treaties, echoed in cultural exchanges, and referenced in literature, music, and art. The Statue of Liberty, gifted by France a century later, stood as a towering symbol of that shared commitment to freedom. A beacon from one republic to another, it reminded the world that the bond forged in war had not been forgotten nor broken. As the decades passed and the memory of the American Revolution grew into legend, the role of France remained an essential, yet often understated element of that story. In classrooms, textbooks, and patriotic speeches, Americans celebrated their founding fathers, praised their military victories, and glorified the idea of independence won through determination and courage. But behind the triumphs and declarations stood another force, quietly vital and historically inseparable: France. Without the support of France, the American cause would likely have withered beneath the weight of British power and imperial reach. The alliance between the newly formed United States and the French monarchy was not born of convenience alone, nor was it sustained purely by shared enmity toward Britain. It was a complex relationship rooted in mutual interests, bound by ideological sympathies, and carried forward by extraordinary individuals who believed that the struggle in America was also a struggle for the soul of the modern world. France had committed itself to an expensive and risky war across the Atlantic, knowing full well the implications. Aiding a rebellion against another monarch raised questions of legitimacy and morality at court. Yet the French crown chose to support the American colonists with millions of livres in loans, arms, and military personnel, driven by both revenge against Britain and a genuine fascination with Enlightenment ideals. The cost was immense, and ultimately the burden would contribute to the financial collapse that led to the French Revolution. But the impact of that choice rippled across centuries and continents. In America, French influence became permanently enshrined in its institutions, traditions, and even its geography. Cities like Fayetteville and Lafayette bear the name of the young nobleman who risked his wealth and status to fight alongside Washington streets and counties across the United States carry names like Rochambeau and de Grasse, quiet acknowledgments of the alliance that shaped a nation's destiny. The bonds forged in war endured far beyond the battlefield. The personal friendships between the American and French leaders played a key role in ensuring the strength of their alliance. George Washington and Lafayette remained in correspondence for decades after the war, exchanging letters that revealed not only political strategies but personal affections. Washington called Lafayette his adopted son, and Lafayette referred to Washington as a second father. When Lafayette returned to America in 1824 for a grand tour, he was met with parade songs and outpourings of affection from a grateful nation. The visit served as a reminder that France had not simply provided aid, but had offered true partnership, forged in sacrifice and shared vision. But the consequences of France's support were not confined to American borders or memories. They deeply affected France itself. As French soldiers and sailors returned home, they brought with them stories of Republican government equality and rights of man. They had seen firsthand a society governed by laws, not lords, and where leadership was earned, not inherited. These experiences added fuel to the growing dissatisfaction within France, where the nobility remained entrenched and the monarchy blind to the changing winds of history. The financial cost of the American War pushed an already weakened treasury closer to collapse. Louis XVI's government increased taxes on an already burdened lower class, while the privileged classes remained largely untaxed. The injustice of this system could no longer be hidden or tolerated, and by 1789, the people of France took to the streets. The fall of the Bastille, the storming of Versailles, and the execution of the king all followed in a rapid and dramatic chain of events. And while many factors led to the French Revolution, the ideological and financial effects of the American War played a critical role. The irony was profound. France had helped give birth to a republic overseas, only to see its own monarchy fall to a revolution. At home, the cycle of rebellion and reform continued across the globe. Inspired by the American Revolution and aided by the precedent of French involvement movements for independence, erupted in Latin America, the Caribbean, and parts of Europe. In Haiti, the enslaved population watched closely as two great empires fought over freedom and sovereignty, and just a few years later, the Haitian Revolution erupted, becoming the first successful slave revolt that led to the creation of a black republic. The domino effect set in motion by the American Revolution and amplified by French support continued to shape global history well into the 19th century. In diplomatic terms, the Franco-American alliance established a new model for international partnerships. Rather than being driven solely by conquest or colonization, the relationship was formed around shared values and mutual benefit. America provided a vision. France provided power. Together, they challenged the dominant order and redefined what alliances could look like in a world previously ruled by monarchs and empires. The legacy of that partnership was perhaps best captured in symbols, monuments, and lasting institutions. One of the most enduring is the Statue of Liberty, a gift from France to the United States in 1886 to celebrate their centennial friendship. Standing tall in New York Harbor, the statue is more than an icon of freedom. It is a testament to the transatlantic bond that began in the fires of revolution. It is a reminder that the fight for liberty is rarely won alone, and that the courage to believe in something greater can unite people across oceans and cultures. The influence of France also extended into the fabric of American political thought. Many of the ideas that shaped the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were deeply informed by French Enlightenment philosophers Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire. These thinkers challenged the divine right of kings, advocated for separation of powers, and called for reason to replace superstition. Their works were widely read by Jefferson, Adams, and Madison, who saw in them a blueprint for a new kind of nation. Even the architecture of the early American government buildings, the neoclassical facades, the columns and domes, spoke to a shared aesthetic and intellectual heritage with France. Though separated by language and ocean, the two nations had found common ground in their pursuit of human dignity and political innovation. Over the years, the relationship would endure moments of tension, including during the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, when American neutrality caused strain. Yet through it all, the foundation laid during the American Revolution held firm. Cultural exchanges, diplomatic missions, educational partnerships, and military collaborations continued to link the two republics as allies and as friends. The true measure of the French connection to the American Revolution lies not just in military aid or diplomatic treaties, but in the idea that liberty could be a shared project, that freedom once ignited could spread beyond borders and inspire generations. The alliance proved that even in a world dominated by empires, oppressed peoples could find allies and build a new order from the ashes of the olden classrooms today. When students learn about the American Revolution, they read about Washington and Jefferson, about the Continental Congress and the Boston Tea Party. But they must also learn about Lafayette and Rochambeau, about the French ships that sailed into Chesapeake Bay, and the diplomats who risked their careers to support a foreign rebellion. They must understand that history is not made by nations alone, but by partnerships and choices, by shared ideals and bold risks. France did not just support the American Revolution, it helped define its success and shape its legacy. In doing so, it changed not only the fate of one nation, but the trajectory of the modern world.